service intervals, specifically in version 2.3. As we moved from Gen 1 into Gen 2, the early iterations of Gen 2 still contain the same service interval integration that we had for pretty much the life cycle of Gen 1, where we were using the Epicor LaserCAD catalog and their user interface as our means to go ahead and resolve that service interval information. We were fairly limited in scope in what we could do there. So what we've done with 2.3 is we have completely rewritten the interface to now where we're just using the same data from Epicor. However, it's now all our wires sitting on top. So we have a lot more flexibility in terms of what we do in resolving those intervals, adding those jobs back onto a transaction. So we're going to walk through a handful of examples as we go through, just to level set before we begin. I'm going to click up here on Help and then About, and what you'll notice is we're using version 2.3.21 as we're recording this webinar, and it's September 27th of 2015. So if you're watching this on a recording, that's where we're at least as far as the webinar is concerned. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get started by just picking on one of my existing work in progress tickets. I'm going to go ahead and begin with Jerry Parker. He's got his 2003 Honda Accord in for service, and at least worth making note of as we start. 117,566 miles is the current mileage on that vehicle. Important only because as we flip over into service intervals, it's going to want to resolve to the most or to the closest mileage interval or the next mileage interval as we go through. Much like if you use SmartyCat, we're looking for some vehicle-specific conditions. With service intervals in 2.3.21, it will remember how we answer these questions, provided our answer is not don't know. So if I told it it had automatic transmission and it had air conditioning and I clicked on OK, it's going to remember that, not just for this service interval search, but for any searches that we would do at some point in time in the future. It'll also remember it if we're using SmartyCat. So these questions that we get asked through the various catalog integrations get stored and maintained in the vehicle record, so we shouldn't have to answer them more than once. So we start out with this vehicle here, and there's actually two different types of services. One of the quirks or nuances when it comes to service interval information is every manufacturer treats service intervals a little bit differently, and that's changed dramatically over the years. It used to be fairly straightforward, where it was 30, 60, 90, or it was 369 in terms of the miles that we were looking at to go ahead and do a particular service. Again, over the years, as we've added in things like maintenance 1, maintenance 2, or time-based services. So the new service intervals is smart enough to recognize that those nuances exist. And so what you'll see is, starts out by default looking at the mileage intervals. And again, if I look through my list here, if I wanted to do a 120,000 mile service, and your options are either the normal, or if you're in what you'd call severe driving conditions, and I can see that there's much more frequency to the interval in a normal, in a severe versus a normal, but we're just going to do that 120K service. We'll come back in and do this a little bit later on, but you'd have the ability to say, let me see what's in the 30, the 60, the 90, so you can select more than one service as we go along. Also on that 2003 Honda Accord, there were services that Honda recommended be done every 36 months, regardless of the mileage of the vehicle. So if I wanted to, we'll include that just to see what that looks like in this case as well. So again, select as many different intervals as you'd like, select as many different options. And again, we'll get into some vehicles that are a little bit more nuanced here a bit later on in the webinar. And then in the lower right-hand corner, we'll click on OK. I apologize. I took too long as I was going through my explanation, and Epicor said, well, I need you to re-resolve the vehicle. So let me come back out here. We've got our 120 and our 36 months, and we'll click on OK. And again, provided that I don't sit there and get too long-winded in my explanation, it takes me in and it's showing me that we've got our 120,000 mile service. And as you look at the legend here, what we've got is we've got the darker grays, which are the labor items. We've got the lighters, the whites, which are the non-application parts and or the parts that we wouldn't resolve through Epicor. So again, if you looked at the ones that are in white, we've got coolant, which I have a specific part number I use for coolant, the oil, the trans fluid, and then again, if it was manual, again, we could do the manual trans fluid as well. I've got my 120K service, which includes an air filter, a cabin air filter, and an oil filter. So these are three vehicle-specific parts that we're going to resolve against the Epicor catalog to determine exactly which one would fit this 2003 Honda Accord. Down towards the bottom, it says the 36-month service includes replacing the brake fluid. So again, independent of the maintenance minder display, replace the brake fluid every 36 months. So if I wanted to go ahead and add one of these onto our transaction, what I do is I use the checkbox that's associated with the service itself. When I select that, what you're going to notice is it says, well, every element of that 120K service automatically gets selected, plus as part of that 120K service, these are the inspection items that should be included along with my replacements. If I say, well, you know what, we're not going to do both an automatic and a manual trans fluid on the vehicle, I'd simply come down and I would uncheck the elements that weren't going to be part of this service as we provide it. So again, pick and choose from the menu, but just start with selecting the service itself, which will by default add in all of the different elements. Let's add this 120K service for this 2003 Honda Accord. The button in the lower right-hand corner now says Go, and when I clicked on Go, it's going to say, well, there were 3 vehicle-specific parts that we needed to find: the air filter, the oil filter, and the cabin air filter. And so now it's working through SmartyCat to say, well, I'm looking at the catalog, and I need to know from my local vendors as well as my local inventory who has an air filter available. In this case, I've got the air filter on my shelf. 2 of them are in stock, so that's the one we're going to add on to this transaction. I'll check the box and I'll click Next. We now have our cabin air filter, which I don't have in my on my shelf, but Napa's got them available. We'll pick the one that's coming from my local Napa, check the box, and then hit Next in the upper right-hand corner. Last but not least, we need an oil filter. I've got those on my shelf. So again, we'll check the one that shows in stock and then hit Next in the upper right-hand corner. Once we've resolved all of the vehicle-specific parts, it takes us to our shopping cart, our posted parts and labor tab. And again, not an unfamiliar tab if you're used to working with SmartyCat. When I want to drop this back onto my transaction, on the right-hand side, we're going to go ahead and click on Post and Exit. You'll notice in labor options, there's 3 different options. And again, this is the same as holds true in SmartyCat, but there is a new configurable setting to tell it specifically for service intervals how this should behave. Your 3 options are to use the predefined description. And if we did that, the description on this job would just be a simplistic factory scheduled maintenance, in my case, based upon how I've got it configured. If we appended the information to the predefined description, then it's going to use this as the header and then include all of the verbiage that came along with the job along with it. In my case, we're going to replace the predefined description. So when I click on Post and Exit, it's going to give me first a message that says, hey, I selected more than one service, both the 120K and the 36-month. Should it go back over to our writer and ignore the remaining services? We'll say yes. We'll come back and talk about, well, what if we wanted to do more than one a bit later on in our conversation? So it comes back over, and you'll notice there's my air filter, my cabin air filter, and my oil filter. I've got other parts that are going to potentially be included as part of this service. Now, we don't want the manual trans fluid, but we do want to charge for coolant. So all I'll do is I'll come up here where it says engine coolant, and my part number for coolant is either .coolAF or .coolDEX based upon whether we're using the Dexos or the regular, and then now I add that on, and it knows the capacity to charge for, in this case, 7 quarts. 4.5 quarts for oil. Again, I'd do the same if I knew the part number that we wanted to use, or if I needed to go out to my catalog and resolve my oil type, I could do that as well. But in this case, just replacing all of the generic parts, the ones that are not vehicle specific, with my part numbers that I use in my local inventory. And now we've built our estimate, including not only the vehicle specific parts, but also the fluids that would be associated with the various services as well. So that one's pretty straightforward. Again, we went out there, we found the service we wanted, we resolved the parts, we brought it back over to our transaction, and then we resolved the parts against my local inventory for those non-application products as we went through. I'm going to leave Jerry alone, and we're going to continue on with another example. We're going to go ahead and pick up John Smith and his 2008 Chevy Silverado. Same concept. If I clicked on service intervals, it's going to take vehicle information out and tell me if there are any vehicle-specific conditions we need to address. In this case, we'll say yes to all 3. We'll say 4-wheel, auto, trans, and air condition. When you come in here, you'll notice we have mileage intervals, time-based services, and then indicator services. So in this case, 65,000 miles was the closest mileage interval let's take a look at the 60,000, the major interval that we likely would have just passed, as well as let's get those 12-month services, and then let's just at least take a look at what maintenance 2 and 1 would be on this particular vehicle. So I'll click on OK, and you'll notice a much longer list of elements that are included. So as I look through the list here, my 60,000 month service just includes rotating the tires. Great. Let's add that onto our transaction. So I check the box, I click on Go, and then I hit Post. So you'll notice my legend changes here. It's now a basket where it shows that we have posted that back over to our transaction. The 12-month service would be the oil and filter, the maintenance 1 lubing the chassis and the oil. So again, if I said let's do the maintenance 1 service, again, you'll notice it picks up all of those different elements, and that would include the vehicle-specific oil filter. So again, when I click on Go, it's going to wheel through my Epicor catalog or through SmartyCAD, finding the applicable oil filter for this vehicle. So I can continue on in this manner as often as I'd like. So if I said, let's go ahead and let's find the oil filter, click on Next, and then Post leaves me in the catalog where I could say, well, let's see. Maintenance 2 includes the oil filter, the reset oil light monitor. Again, so I may or may not say, well, let's do maintenance 2. However, let's not do the oil change along with that. And when I do that and then click on Go in the lower right-hand corner, again, we're going to skip past the oil filter, not a necessary element. And then if that's the last one I wanted to add, I'll hit Post and Exit. I did have that time-based 12-month service that was included as well. So that's why it's giving me my message about exit and ignore remaining services. Well, when I click on Yes, again, I've got my 60,000 mile service, I've got my maintenance 1 and my maintenance 2, which again, I'll take the oil off of there. We're not going to include that since it's part of the maintenance 1. But if I double clicked and looked at the description, there's all the different verbiage that was out there. Again, it gets fairly extensive, but everything that was listed as we were there, not only in the inspection items, but also in the service itself, gets brought over and added into the text. I could certainly modify it if I saw fit, but again, we're going to bring all of those elements forward as we go along. So again, a little bit more nuanced as far as that vehicle was concerned. Going to keep picking on some of my work in progress tickets. You can go ahead and take a look at Rick Sturmel and his 2012 Nissan Frontier. So again, same concept of heading out to service intervals. We'll say that it does have automatic transmission. And then now what you're going to notice is mileage intervals and then additional services. And then down to the lower left, you'll notice premium maintenance versus Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. As I started out my conversation about service intervals, one of the quirks or one of the realities of service intervals is that every manufacturer looks at them these days a little bit differently. So as opposed to normal and severe, this Nissan Frontier would have a Schedule 1 or a Schedule 2. And again, we can select from all three. If I said I want that 60, I want the Schedule 1 60,000 mile service and the Schedule 2 60,000 mile service, plus, you know what, how about that multi-point inspection, and then click on OK. So it brings them all together. The premium maintenance 60,000 mile service includes these elements. Just your maintenance 1 includes these, and I'm sorry, Schedule 2 is going to include these. Again, there's your multi-point inspection service. Now, all that would include would be some inspection elements. So again, you'll notice nothing underneath there, at least as far as parts and or labor to perform, but all of these inspection items, which based upon Epicor's time, would take a 1 hour effort in order to go ahead and do all of those inspections. So again, a little bit different nuance than Frontier displays than our Honda Accord and our examples as we've gone through. A couple other service intervals. If you looked at, you've got specific conditions. You can see, well, to Auto Trans, it already knew that we had answered no to all-wheel drive. So if either of those questions were answered incorrectly, an opportunity to update or move on. Service types, come back to my window where I can see my maintenance my maintenance items. So it's kind of the back button, if you will. And then as I continue on, I'll click on OK to get back in that window there. Print would allow me to just print. Now, I apologize, I didn't select the service. So that's going to help if we tell it what we'd actually like to print. And then we've got our print that comes up, and there's all of my parts. Here's all of my labor and inspection items that would be included. And then print specs is actually not related to service intervals at all. Print specs, again, it was functionality that existed in the old LaserCAD interface of service intervals, But if I wanted to just print all of the different vehicle specifications that I'm aware of or that Epicor can give me for this particular vehicle, Print Specs will give me an opportunity to just print those. So there's all of our different specifications that we're printing as we go through. So again, a couple of different or other features within service intervals that we have an opportunity to take advantage of. In the lower left, there's our legend. Not viewed, it's excluded, it's been viewed, and or it's been posted. And in the upper right-hand corner, there's an option there for settings. If I click on settings, again, you'll notice right now I'm showing the description and the price. I'm not showing the skill level of technician it would require or the years that this would apply to, the factory time and or the sell price. So again, we have those included. Sell and extended price should be the same. Factory time is going to be only if we have a configured modifier so that it says if the book says 1, add 10% and make it 1.1 as we go through. I'm sorry, that would be our estimate versus our factory time. This would be modified based upon our multiplier, pardon me, excuse me, and or factory time would be what it actually says in the book as we go along. One last example we'll take a look at as far as service intervals are concerned. I'm going to finish up with this 2011 Ford Edge at the very bottom. We click on service intervals for that 2011 Ford Edge, takes us out, and again, any vehicle-specific conditions that might apply, but in this case, you'll notice 5 different options that Ford gives us for for regular maintenance on that Ford Edge. The 90,000 is the closest mile interval. We've got a 6-month service, the multi-point inspection. They're telling us that we should do an engine oil service based upon the indicator. And then also, let's say we're in dusty conditions. What should we do every 5,000 versus every 30,000 miles? And again, I click on OK. And all it does is it says, well, you selected, in this case, 6 different elements. So here's each one individually. There's the 90,000 mile service. We'll minimize that one. So we're only looking at the 6-month or the multi-point inspection, the engine oil service, the every 5,000 miles when dusty, and the every 30,000 miles when dusty. So again, you can select the different elements that are applicable, and again, making it easier to see by minimizing the ones that are not maybe necessarily what I'm looking for at that particular moment in time. So again, service intervals Gen 2, much more powerful than what we've ever had integrated to our rider previously. And it uses Epicor's factory scheduled maintenance. And again, as I had said on a couple of previous occasions, it gets a lot more nuanced as we get into later model vehicles, as manufacturers have started to be more explicit in terms of not just 30, 60, 90K or 369. It's now looking at scheduled services, every so often time-based services, and the like. One more piece that I want to talk about, it's not really related to service intervals, but it's a new icon that we added with Gen 2 as well. That's this interchange button up here at the top. Interchange also was a facet that existed in the old LaserCat catalog. So this functionality, not new to our writer as much as it's new to SmartyCat. It's now our writer's functionality as opposed to using the old LaserCat integration. What we can do in here, and again, my personal opinion, this is most applicable if we said, well, I'd like to put in an OE part number. So this is the part number we took off the vehicle, and I want to know what is, in my case, I've got it defaulted to CarQuest's equivalent, but when I click on lookup, then it's going to go through and tell me, well, what CarQuest carries is these 4 numbers as a replacement for a 252711. How about AutoZone? Well, let's go back up and let's pick AutoZone out of my list here. And it's going to go back and tell me, well, AutoZone carries that Gates water pump, a 43315. I could also use the All Lines button to say, well, let's see. I want to know what AC Delco. We'll go with AirTex. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. We'll look at CarQuest because we had it in there before. How about a Federated? And also Gates. And then go ahead and click on OK. And again, each of these will show us if the vendor has a part in that category, what that part number would be. Looks like CarQuest doesn't actually carry the AC Delco line of that product, but a 251-579C would be the AC Delco equivalent for that 252-711. If I was to check a box, that transfer button lights up. And if I wanted to add that onto my ticket, I would just hit transfer. It brought it forward. Knows that AutoZone was the vendor I had selected in my drop-down box. So if I hit post and exit, then it's going to drop that on. Now I still had factory scheduled maintenance labor selected as my option. Probably not the most applicable in this case, but I could have modified that labor job or added it onto an existing if I already had it out there. So again, interchange, you could interchange part from aftermarket vendor to aftermarket vendor. So I've got AutoZone's part number show me CarQuest's, but I find it to be most applicable when you've got an OE number that you're trying to figure out an aftermarket replacement for. What's also new with Gen 2, or really version 2.3, it is not specifically applied to service intervals. There's actually no relevance between the two, but two new features that we added with version 2.3. So again, it at least merits conversation as we go through a webinar.